Welcome to Orthodox Christian Theology. This is Craig Trulli, and with me today is George, the author of Errors of the Latins with Uncommon Press. This is just volume 2. There are 2 volumes to this encyclopedic work. So, George, how are we doing today?
Hey, I'm doing well. Thanks for having me on, Craig.
This has been a book I've been following for years, literally as pretty much almost as long as I've been Orthodox. You have been writing this. It's been in PDF and it's been an evolving project. And really, what you put together is an encyclopedia of the errors of the Roman Catholic Church. And you call it Errors of the Latins in order to be in homage of Errors of the Greeks of Thomas Aquinas. We've done other interviews and we've discussed, how you chose the title and everything. But I really want to get to the bottom of what you think are the 5 crucial, biggest errors of Roman Catholicism, because honestly speaking, in the age of AI, we're going to eventually begin having real debates over what's even a real source. I already noticed on Twitter that the information landscape is starting to be distorted with fake patristic quotes, with fake PL and PG citations. And so the fact that someone could get something encyclopedic on this topic with so much information before the point in which we're having a contaminated information landscape is very useful. And I want people to have recourse to those actual books themselves from Uncut Mountain Press. The link to purchase the books from the press is below. So in talking about this, we certainly cannot talk about how many pages, 1,300 pages are these 2 volumes?
Right. Yeah, 1,300 pages across the 2 volumes.
And so if those aren't aware, George is a Antiochian Orthodox Christian. He's a cradle Orthodox Christian. This is not a work of, let's say, the stereotype convert to Orthodoxy in a cage stage. This has been something that George has worked on for many years. And it's just finally been published in its final edition. And so to get everyone interested, I want to kind of sum up the cream of this book. And you made a choice of what you thought the 5 biggest errors covered in this book were. And you felt the biggest was Filioque added to the creed. So you're telling me this isn't a nothing burger, George?
Yeah, it is of course, different people have different thoughts on what's the most critical, but I mean, always the top 2 have been the Filioque and the papacy, mainly just because of the impact to the creed. And that's a huge topic we can get into. And I know, there's been recent ecumenical discussions. I mean, the attempt of the book is to almost argue as if we're, let's say, in the year 1900, before modern ecumenism, to see what how the Roman Catholicism and Orthodoxy relate, and to see the traditional take on these positions. And I defend Orthodoxy as being more traditional. So we could get into the Filioque topic, the controversy, if you like.
You discuss how the primary reason for the 1054 schism, which is the traditional dating. In reality, the Crusades, it took a few centuries for the schism to become categorical. But the line was definitely drawn in the sands with the Filioque. So how about you talk to us about how this started with Pope Leo III saying that there shouldn't be additions to the creed, and why this is a big error for Roman Catholics.
Yeah, that is definitely important. And as a side note, I didn't use any AI at all in the book. It is something that I think would be concerning for someone writing on that in the future. There's a note, I wanted to edit it, but I kind of caught it too late, where in the beginning I thanked modern technology for helping me write. All of that is just referring to digitized libraries and emails. And that's basically it, just being able to have books digitized.
No AI, got it.
Yeah, that didn't use any AI at all. So Filioque. So there's 2 main points in the dispute: whether it is licit to add it to the creed, and whether the theological dogma is true or not. So I focused more on the question of should it be added to the creed, and because that's a lot easier to demonstrate from historical records. And and that was a huge issue right at the time of the schism. In fact, Patriarch Peter of Antioch, he said, um, if the Roman Catholics simply removed this, uh, the filioque from the creed, then I wouldn't ask for any other changes, even though there were other items in dispute on leavened bread and so on. But that was the really the issue that couldn't be negotiated or compromised on at all. Just that word.
And so, like, without getting into even the theology of it for the moment, the real error is that the Roman Catholics added to the creed against to the consensus of the church, that they made a creed, an ecumenical council, that there was a council in 879 that stated that the creed cannot be added to. And on top of this, it was recognized by earlier popes that they shouldn't change the creed. So it just seems to be an act against charity that they would just unilaterally do this, knowing the problems it would create in the church itself, in defiance to agreements not to. Leaping off from there, what else are the ramifications that make this such a big error?
Yeah, and of course there's discussions on, okay, well, if it's, people try to switch it. If it's true, why object to it? So that people try to switch it to the theology, or maybe on more trivial variations that have happened with the creed. But this filioque was considered something that shouldn't be added, and I think it is important to insist on Pope Leo III's words on this. He was very direct when he was asked about this, and just said, no, it cannot be done. And I'm really just surprised with how many people historically have not thought it's important to to heed his words. And
well, does this speak to, and this will get a little ahead of ourselves, so we won't dwell on it, but does this speak to that when a pope says something and they agree with it, it has authority and it must be heeded? But if a pope says something and they don't agree with it, it's not ex cathedra, it could be ignored. That there's a sort of obvious, transparent pivot, and it's on that basis.
Yeah, I have a whole section written on this. I know you're familiar with it. I just quote in English, the dialogue that happened in the year 809. The Pope made a judgment.
And this is Pope Leo III.
Yeah, Pope Leo III. He had the delegates of a council held in France, and then they came to ask him if they can add the filioque to the creed, but the delegates keep asking the Pope over and over again, and he says, no, it cannot be added. It's been prohibited. And he says, this is the judgment. And he says he does not even hold himself above those councils. He's very firm on this point. So although he does say that filioque is true, and that's maybe a separate matter, his interpretation of what it is maybe different. But he still realized the importance of not allowing the creed to be tampered with, especially because it's a quote straight from the Gospels. I will send you the Holy Spirit who proceeds from the Father. And yes, another point is that at the time of the schism, there was it appears that the West thought the Greeks took out the filioque from the creed. It's really strange that they didn't seem to maybe hold the creed in such regard, or didn't think it was as important,
or that knowledge was forgotten so quickly, because when this was alleged in 1054, perhaps in not total earnestness, I would have to think, it was only about 40 years most likely removed from when Rome added it to their creed. And so there would have been people alive in Rome that would have known that was completely untrue. The reason why people think that 1014 was the year Rome added the filioque, because it's the first time we have a letter from a pope upon his consecration, which generally they have these consecrational letters called schistic letters, and they give their creedal confessions. And so it's the first time we have one from a pope where when he gives the creed, it has the filioque in it. So that's why traditionally 1014 is considered the year when Rome added the filioque to the creed. So in 1054, 40 years is a long time later. Of course, a lot of people would have died, especially back then, but there would have definitely been people alive that remembered the filioque was in the creed. So it's very peculiar. It's a peculiar statement. But before we maybe move on to that, I wanted to add that in the discussion with Pope Leo III and the Frankish legates, that Pope Leo III says, matter of factly, that in the creeds that this edition is found nowhere, because people need to be aware there was more than just the Constantinopolitan Creed, which would have been confessed during baptism. The West had the Athanasian Creed. There's, of course, the Apostles' Creed in the West. And so, as far as Pope Leo III was aware, this wasn't in those creeds either. And it seems that the Frankish legates grant this point. And so oftentimes people will say, well, the Athanasian Creed has a filioque and thereby it's ancient or something like this. But only later versions, only the earliest version with that Athanasian Creed with the filioque would be in the 8th century among the Franks. And it seems that, at least as recorded in the dialogue between the Frankish legates of Pope Leo III, that they grant that this was something not found in other creeds elsewhere. And so this would seem to include the Athanasian Creed, because there's only so many ancient creeds there were. So that being said, you have an interesting quote here from the Catholic Encyclopedia, because it seems to be a flagrant omission. It's not that what we're saying is something in the Orthodox apologetics bubble, but here the Catholic Encyclopedia states that the practice of adding the filioque was retained in spite of papal advice, and in the middle of the 11th century, it had gained a firm foothold in Rome itself. Scholars do not agree as to the exact time to its introduction to Rome, but most assign it to the reign of Benedict VIII, 1014 to 15. So why did you zero in on that quote, George?
Yeah, I think it's important to, well, throughout the whole book, my aim was to quote traditional Roman Catholic authorities, and like ideally before 1920, mainly because I'm trying to appeal to traditionally minded Roman Catholics. So, there's a lot of quotes from the Catholic Encyclopedia, which was supported. It was encouraged by the Pope. He did sign the Catholic Encyclopedia as a sort of. He signed 26 copies of a special Vatican edition. But anyway, I'm going off topic.
Well, but your point is that this is a traditional Roman Catholic source that had
Yes.
official acceptance. You're not claiming it's a ex cathedra infallible statement, but that what it states is a high level acknowledgement among very informed traditional Roman Catholics.
Yeah, and they admit, they say the filioque. They said, in spite of the papal advice. I mean, well, the Pope is the teacher, said to be the teacher of all Christians, and you would expect his followers would listen to his advice to omit the filioque in the creed, especially in the authoritative context of a papal examination into the decrees of a local church council and the Pope's judgment of that creed. So it's an important issue. The so-called advice deals with an issue affecting the entire church, because the creed is the faith that binds the members of the church, the whole church. So this was good wisdom. It's strange that subsequent Roman Catholic authorities don't follow the wisdom of Pope Leo III and persist in that.
Well, it really probably wasn't their choice at a certain point, right? It was necessary due to who was invading Italy in the 11th century and who was calling the shots. But that being said, you speak further on this topic that the big error of Roman Catholics adding to the creed, that they inconsistently allow reciting the creed without the filioque, allowing for two different creeds. Could you flesh it out a little bit?
Yeah. So this is one of the sections I mentioned because, there was this dispute always with, the Roman Catholics do allow their Eastern rites to not have to say the filioque in the creed. Of course, they must profess the doctrine, but that point was in dispute as well. They've been inconsistent on that in the West. So there is a passage from Pope Nicholas III where he was writing, giving instructions to his legates going to the East, saying, that quote, unity of faith does not permit diversity in its confessors or confession, especially in the chanting of the creed. So he was specifically saying that the East must recite the filioque in the creed. So in a sense, the creed should be binding all Christians together, but if they're allowing a variation, it appears inconsistent. And I
Well,
also,
it would be in defiance of what Pope Nicholas III said in the wake of the Council of Lyon, which dogmatized the filioque for the Roman Catholics.
yeah, and so you would expect their church to say the same creed. That's a symbol of Christian unity and Catholicity throughout the world. And then I also, in the chapter, I quote the Council of Trent, which has a rather remarkable statement. I could quote that here quickly, where it says, okay, in the more outstanding councils, we're accustomed at the beginning of their work to use this shield against heresies, the creed, with which alone they have at times drawn unbelievers to the faith, overcame heretics, and confirmed the faithful. For this reason, it has thought it well, the Council of Trent, that the symbol of faith which the Holy Roman Church uses as the cardinal principle wherein all who profess the faith of Christ necessarily agree, and as the firm and sole foundation against which the gates of hell shall never prevail, be expressed in the same words in which it is read in all the churches, which is as follows: I believe, and that the Council of Trent proceeds to recite the creed with the filioque. So it calls, I found it interesting, I mentioned this in the book, where the Council of Trent calls the creed the sole shield against heresies. But if you remember Pope Leo III, he inscribed shields of silver on St. Peter's tomb of the creed without the filioque in Latin and Greek. And the Trent calls the creed the firm and sole foundation. Interesting, they call that the sole foundation against which the gates of hell shall never prevail. So they're interpreting the creed to be that foundation. Yet the filioque is like a wedge splitting this. And then, moreover, lastly, the statement that the creed is expressed in the same words in which it is read in all the churches is, and seems, at least to me, inconsistent with the permission for allowing Eastern rites to not say the filioque. So it seems inconsistent with the Council of Trent's
decree. So there seems to be a inconsistency with the hermeneutic of even how the magisterial authorities are understood in Roman Catholicism, because they're well aware of the unia and the diversity allowed here, and thereby they must now interpret the words of Trent to be other than what they clearly say. So these are some of the difficulties that the diverse and developed history of the Roman Catholic faith poses people that are going to try to legalistically defend that there has been no errors of any sort. It's that for that reason, that's why most academics that are Roman Catholic don't take that sort of hardline stand. But this is what most people are exposed to in when being evangelized by a Roman Catholic apologists. So you make the point that the councils, and we're talking about the ecumenical councils before the schism, speak of the creed in a way that makes it difficult for it to have added an insertion into it. Do you mind fleshing that out a little bit?
Yeah, and that's one of the major points to talk about, is that the councils, really their words, the way they talk about the creed, I can't see that as allowing for the addition of the filioque. So, and that's one of the approaches I take in the book, is just quoting at length, just to give readers the context of what I felt was important in and what has been seen as important in this question of just what has been the view of the church fathers and later councils on the creed. So let me pull it up. I have, I'm looking at my copy here. Let me see. So I have this passage correct. But in summary, all the following councils recited the creed without the filioque. At Ephesus, I think there was, I'm not too familiar about that, but I know at Chalcedon afterwards, they always recited the creed, the Nicene-Constantinopolitan Creed, without the filioque. And they even talk about the addition of, because it seems that at first the Nicene Creed did not have "we believe" and "in the Holy Spirit," or it simply had "in the Holy Spirit," "we believe in the Holy Spirit," but then afterwards it was added "we believe in the Holy Spirit who proceeds from the Father." And later councils talk about why those words were added, "who proceeds from the Father," say that's to counter the heretics and So that's the context for this. Yeah, I'll need to find the passage so I can
Well,
properly cite. Yeah.
there's a big book where they could get that information, but so people aware there's a traditionally it's called the Canon of Ephesus. It's part of its decree, really, that doesn't allow any innovations to the creed. And this is reiterated in subsequent councils and finally in Constable 879, 880, which had the reception of the Roman Synod and Pope John VIII. That council likewise decrees that there cannot be any additions made to the creed, but that's obviously within the context of the existence of the Filioque. So that was the occasion that motivated the council to make that decree. But now let's switch gears a little bit and talk about mandatory clerical celibacy. It really doesn't come up a lot in apologetics. It's actually not an issue I don't think I really ever talk about. And so you argue this is one of the biggest errors of the Roman Catholic Church because this policy caused perhaps the most social damage. So could you give us some detail on that?
Yeah, and this I think because it impacted culture so much. I think that's why I consider it one of the most important in terms of the debate between Roman Catholicism and Orthodoxy. It's taken, yeah, it has been debated, but hasn't been one of the principal subjects in dispute. But the Council of Trello did at an early point criticize those in Rome for requiring this, and it said priests should be allowed to be with their wives. So, I mean, the sad thing is that despite all the rules in the West and in the Latin West on the priests not being able to be married, there were still many priests who did have partners who were, in effect, their wives, basically. And that was very common. And there were so many illegitimate children. And it just caused, I think, a bad state of things in society to have, this awkward connection of illegitimacy. And then I mentioned there's evidence that priests pressured their partners to procure abortions when they impregnated their partners. And I mean, all this stuff would have been avoided. And there's a lot of scandals. I try to avoid talking too much about scandals in the book, but these are one of the things that is just not good. I mean, many bishops and cardinals in the West did have multiple children, and and yes, but to talk about the theological point, they, at the time of that 1054 schism, it's surprising that the Pope and his legates, they called priestly marriage heresy. I mean, that's how I see their words when you look at that famous 1054 anathemas, and it's strange that along with saying that the Greeks removed the filioque from the creed, it calls clerical marriage a sin or heresy, depending on how you read it, and they've been inconsistent as well. Many of them have said that it's a requirement, basically, of the New Testament priesthood by nature that priests must be celibate. But of course, they're inconsistent with allowing the Eastern Rite Roman Catholic priests to have wives. So, and that led to also an issue when in the Americas, when that led to many Eastern Rite priests converting to Orthodoxy because they faced a hard time from their bishops in the West, because the bishops didn't even quite understand or know that in the East that priests were permitted to be married, or they really didn't like that custom or didn't want it in America. Of course, that's tough when you have the different ethnic mixings in the New World. So those are some of the main points I've seen. Yeah, they've been just this inconsistency of how they approach it, and I think you can quote some of their ecumenical councils on that seem to say that priests shouldn't be married at all, which would contradict their later permission to have a married priesthood.
Now, you have some of the details here. You said that the whole assembly, the clergy, the Council of Nicaea assented to the reasoning of Paphnutius, and this is quoted by the historian Socrates. And so the Council of Nicaea, how did it weigh in on this issue?
Yeah, so that is disputed whether it's a real happening at the council or if it's a forgery. Um, Roman Catholics had traditionally said this was a forgery, but I found at least one pope who admitted that it happened. And let me see if I can pull that. I don't know if I can pull it up at the top of my. If I can find this quick. Oh, okay, yeah. Aeneas Sylvius. Well, he wrote before he became Pope Pius II. He did mention the story of Paphnutius as authentic, along with who else was it? Pope Pius IV in the year 1564. He admitted the authenticity in an epistle to the German princes who had requested the concession of sacerdotal marriage. So, and yeah, many Roman Catholics had asked for this. It was a very, I mean, I can't overstate this, and it is quite depressing. And you can get a lot of these details in Henry Charles Lay's 2-volume work called History of Clerical Celibacy. And okay, maybe I got deviated. Okay, Paphnutius. Yeah. So he's a saint. He was a monk. He had suffered during the persecutions. He had grown up basically from a young boy in a monastery, and the historians say, to put it frankly, he had never known a woman. So he was very highly regarded. He lost an eye in the persecutions. It said that Emperor Constantine would kiss his empty eye socket and in veneration. And so he stood up when the Council of Nicaea was considering passing a rule to mandate clerical celibacy. He stood up and said he quoted St. Paul saying this: the marriage bed is honorable in all, and this would be too much of a burden to put. And he convinced the council, and the records say the whole council ascended to the reasoning of Paphnutius. So this is the ecumenical decision of the church. Now, it's not recorded in the canons. But there's been other decisions of councils that aren't recorded in the canons. There's other decisions like Nicaea on the Easter.
The Nicaea doesn't have a set of minutes. The first council, the set of minutes is Ephesus. And so we would only find details of this from either the letters promulgated from the council, like to the Alexandrian bishops, or from the historians that had access to some of these sources.
Right. And yeah, I think the Arians had burned the Acts, but there's still some records of them in some scattered Syriac fragments. I'm not too familiar on that, but anyway, I mean, there have been some Orthodox scholars who disputed the authenticity of the story of Paphnutius, but I quote many Roman Catholics who admit it, along with multiple.
And for what it's worth, in Roman Catholic apologetics, Socrates very often is quoted in favor of certain things like papal doctrines, because he does speak to all these appeals made to the Pope. So this does speak to maybe the selective reading of Socrates, if we accept his interpretations, authenticity of some historical episodes and not others when they're inconvenient. So Let's talk about what I think is the biggest problem as a parent, and that is not communing and chrismating infants. There's a show that was done with Rita Paul Trinka, myself, on this topic, and it, in my opinion, is by far the biggest error, because we are all agree that the Eucharist is the medicine of immortality. We all agree that baptism forgives sins. We all agree that chrismation is the indwelling, brings about the indwelling of the Holy Spirit. And yet the Roman Catholic Church normally doesn't do these things for the young. They baptize, then they delay by many years communing, and then they delay by even more years confirmation. So you start as a 1/3 Roman Catholic, then for many years you're a 2/3 Roman Catholic, and then eventually you're a full Roman Catholic. It's very bizarre, with no precedent in the early church. And so what's this speak to? The sacramental grace that is being made available to many alleged Roman Catholic Christians. They're not being given and not partaking in the full sacramental life of the Roman Catholic Church. And for anyone that's going to get married and wants to have a family, or has a young family and is looking seriously at these issues, this is so critical if we understand the importance of the sacraments, that Even if you're Roman Catholic and are not convinced of Eastern Orthodox claims, it would seem incumbent upon you to become a union for this issue alone. And if you don't, it would reveal that you really don't believe the sacraments are what they are, in all honesty. This is how scandalous this issue really is in my mind. But George, in the book, you talk about how infant communion was nearly the unanimous practice at the first millennium. I don't know why you say nearly, because it was completely unanimous. What are you trying to modify there? Are you trying to talk about when we start seeing the first rumblings of change, maybe in the 9th and 10th centuries? Or how about you flesh that out for us?
Yeah. It's sometimes hard to track exactly when the practice ended. I mean, a lot of Roman Catholic scholars themselves say it was unanimous till the 13th century, but there are some examples in the 800s or 9th century of some places in the Frankish kingdom area to not allow infants to receive the Eucharist unless they were at the point of death. I mean, and yeah, there had been differences on how infants were communed, but yeah, this was a unanimous practice as for all intents and purposes, and it is startling that, I mean, it hasn't received too much discussion in the older debates from, let's say, from the time of Photius to the schism in 1054, or even in later centuries. I think I'm not sure when it's first brought up, but of course it's mentioned in the 1848 and 1895 encyclicals. I think you could say this might be the biggest issue, because at least for those who have maybe an ecumenical mindset, who have already willing to work out maybe a compromise on the papacy or some understanding of the filioque. But this, I mean, it's a hard discontinuity from the tradition, and I don't see how it's justified at all, because, I mean, I quote Pope Pius X right at the beginning of the chapter. He said this, as was prescribed in almost all ancient ritual books, was done at baptism until the 13th century, and this custom prevailed in some places even later. So that's Pope Pius X in the year 1910. I always tried my best to quote these traditional popes, at least before Vatican II, so I don't get any.
Well, you quote, if I remember, Saint Augustine, I think, on Pope Innocent. So this is in the 5th century, where Saint Augustine, in arguing the Pelagians, quotes the Pope as saying that it's necessary for the salvation of infants to commune.
Yeah, and so when talking to the Roman Catholics, I mean, pretty much that's their only response. They'll say, "Oh, it's not necessary for salvation." They'll make some excuse based on that, and first of all, it is it's not a good grounds to have in defense to say, "Oh, the Eucharist is not necessary for salvation." I mean, strictly speaking, they're correct with edge cases like that. There's one given of a catechumen who died before he could receive the Eucharist, and of course these are, he was baptized when he was unconscious, but he passed away before he could get the Eucharist. So he was asked by I believe Saint Fulgentius said he was saved, because baptism provides itself participation in the body and blood of Christ. So they can stretch maybe those kind of symbology to say, okay, baptism is sufficient, but that's beside that point. There's the real point is, this is what the church fathers, this is how they interpreted the Bible to mean that infants should receive communion. And the Council of Trent says we shouldn't interpret scripture otherwise than by the unanimous consent of the church fathers. So that's how they saw the words of Christ saying to give communion to infants. I did a whole talk with Sava just on this one topic, Sava Bornelis, on like a week or two ago on YouTube. And and I think the other defense Roman Catholics give is they'll say, okay, for baptism it's necessary because Christ says, unless a man is born of water, they'll say, because Christ says, unless a man, so like anybody will apply for baptism, but for the Eucharist he says, unless you eat the body and blood of Christ. So they say, unless, the words "you" means that someone who can listen and understand those words. So, but this interpretation is foreign to the church fathers. They don't make that sort of claim. I don't think it's really justified from the text, the original text itself.
It speaks to the fact that the natural reading of these issues, like when they talk about, oh, this person died without baptism, they're saved. The idea of someone saying that isn't that baptism is unnecessary for salvation, but that, like, for these martyrs, it's something that then that God's grace could operate through their martyrdom. It's not meant to make a normative change in the understanding of the necessity of all the sacraments. And I think anyone reading these early sources honestly would realize that's exactly where they're coming from when discussing these exceptions and providing consolation to people. That being said, whenever we start approaching the writings of fathers, like defense attorneys taking juridical precedents out of context in order to get someone off for some sort of crime, we should immediately recognize this is not how one would deal with an issue if what they're defending was the truth as opposed to a guilty party. So this is something that the idea that we would postpone baptism to the age of reason because of scholastic speculation, as opposed to the fact that we understand, even if weren't absolutely a necessity for salvation in every circumstance, that the sacramental grace is beneficial towards salvation, it just wouldn't be grounds for not making it available to people. It would be like saying that we know of people that survived from falling out of an airplane without a parachute. It's a small list. It's a little less than 20 people. Therefore, because it's possible, we should not give people parachutes when they, if we make them jump out of planes, like to skydivers or paratroopers, we would immediately recognize as ridiculous. But yet, when it's theology, which is the queen of sciences, we all of a sudden adopt what is a very ignorant mindset if we were to adopt the same mindset and apply to pretty much anything else other than what defense attorneys do when trying to get guilty people off. If we see that, we should immediately recognize there's something wrong here. This is, and honestly speaking, something demonic, right? This is not how the truth would be defended.
Yeah.
So
I could add that Pope Pius X in his catechism, there's a question. It says, do they sin who are old enough to receive communion and do not? The answer is, in the answer, it says, yes, they undoubtedly sin. So, I mean, infants are old enough to receive communion, and yet they do not. So it's almost as if Pope Pius X catechism, it's condemning the practice of Roman Catholicism. And he says that their parents or guardians also sin if the delay of communion is owing to their fault, and they shall have to render a strict account to God for it. So, I mean, Pius X was referring to those who had attained the age of reason, and he had pushed to lower the age of reason. But the early church gave communion to infants, and they do qualify to receive communion and to benefit from it. So we can say that this practice is definitely not in accordance with the intention of the church. And also, I think you
make the point that Roman Catholics have not provided a valid reason to abandon these common ancient usages. So let's even just grant that it's not the end of the world if we don't commune infants. On what basis do we do away with the practice, right? That becomes normative. There's never a good reason given other than, well, we're doing something that's not so good and we're just going to live with it, right? Have you heard of that actual good reason? Because I actually have not, in all honesty.
No. I mean, the only thing I hear is they just say, oh, it's not necessary. Like, and they'll argue for those, edge cases that, it's not strictly necessary. But, I mean, it is necessary in a general sense that, it's necessary to receive Christ's body and blood. And that's it. Yeah, and that one explanation of the gospel to say like to you only applies to those at age of reason. I have not seen any good explanation of why they changed it. It's maybe just the scholastic idea of age of reason that they want. But of course, that could apply to baptism as well, saying infants can't distinguish between a bath or baptism. I mean, that's how they say, oh, infants can't distinguish between normal food and the Eucharist. Well, it's not the right way to think about. That's not how the early church thought about these things. And I remember coming across a debate between a Protestant and an Orthodox about infant baptism, and the Protestant said, "Oh, well, if you're consistent, you would give infants communion." And the Protestant didn't know that the Orthodox do that. And the Orthodox priest was like, "Oh, we do give infants communion." So embarrassing for the Protestant.
Well, at least he recognized the inconsistency there, and sometimes a hostile witness that corroborates something does speak volumes. Now, on a very similar note, the fourth biggest error of Roman Catholicism that you identify is not administering holy unction to the sick. So, how about you tell us a little about that? Because this is one of the seven sacraments. You'd think this is important, and yet it's actually not even used for its primary purpose anymore in the Roman Catholic Church.
Yeah, and that's from the origins are from St. James when he says, "Is anyone sick among you? Let the priest come and basically administer the sacrament." So in the Catholic Encyclopedia, you can see it quoted there. They admit there was a change of practice in the 12th and 13th centuries, and it used to be the sacrament was applied to those who were sick and suffering from illness, and the practice changed to be that it was intended only for the dying, and it changed its name really to extreme unction, in extremis in Latin. So that's at the end of your life. It was given often on people's deathbeds, which wasn't the intention, as if there was like no hope of recovery. The aim of it is at least to pray for recovery. I mean, it's not always the case, but there have been many miracles in Orthodoxy recorded of when there has been recovery after the sacraments applied. But there's also spiritual benefits as well. So yeah, this one is not mentioned in the 1848 or 1895 encyclicals, but it is mentioned by other Orthodox in the 1800s, talking about the errors of the Latins. And I think what we could do is, if you want to see the next slide, I do compare the Council of Trent, because I think this one is maybe the clearest case of the Council of Trent's definition being incorrect. It's also incorrect on the infant communion, where it had mistakenly said, "Oh, it was a practice in some places." Infant communion, the Council of Trent said that, which is misleading. Same with the Catechism of the Council of Trent. Now, Roman Catholics just respond, okay, councils can be mistaken in historical matters, but not in dogma. But I think this is both mistaken in the dogma and in the historical statement, because it's basically anathematizing anyone who says that the Roman Church is not following the practice that was established by the Apostle James. So, but they do admit that.
So let's read this. The anathema says, "If anyone says that the rite and usage of extreme unction, which the Holy Roman Church observes, is at variance with the statement of the blessed Apostle James, and is therefore to be changed and may without sin be despised by Christians, let him be anathema." And compare that to Catholic Encyclopedia, which says, "Down to the 12th century in the Western Church, the practice was given to unction freely to all, except public penitents who were suffering from any serious illness without waiting to decide whether danger of death was imminent. This is clear from many testimonies, but during the 12th, 13th centuries, a change of practice took place." So it seems to anathematize people that are stating what is later acknowledged not to be true. Yeah. I will say this, though, that word "and," if I were to, again, be the defense attorney, where it says, well, if anyone says the rite and usage of extreme unction, right? So not just unction in of itself. So we could already say, oh, well, just extreme unction, which the Holy Roman Church observes is at variance of the statement of the Blessed Apostle James, right? Because say, well, he didn't say you can't use it for people right about to die, and is therefore to be changed, and may without sin be despised by Christians. Like, we can't let people despise this, and is a necessary additional condition. Let him be anathema. So, right? So you could argue, well, the anathema is for people despising unction, right? And not all these little other facets. But again, this speaks to, if you have to defend this stuff like a defense attorney, you already know that what you're defending is guilty. And that is my point here. And just so people aware, in ye old English, this is how they spoke. So you have to be aware that the actual meaning of these words, even as translated, is essentially how George's covering it here. That if you believe that the unction was different, is different than now in the Roman Church than it was during James' day, and thereby should be reformed. So it's more like what you read James to mean, and the church history says, then you're anathema. That's what they really mean, right? But if I want to just purposely interpret this very legalistically and go against what it clearly means, then we could defend it like the defense attorney.
Yeah, I try to be fair and not like put words in the mouth of Roman Catholics. I know they were often subtle and careful in how they made various definitions, especially in the Council of Trent. I think, yeah, this might be maybe the clearest case, I think, of an error in the Council of Trent. But
well, it's because
yeah,
when it's saying therefore to be changed and may without sin be despised, what they mean is changing it is despising it, right? That's the actual meaning. It's not an actual additional criterion.
yeah, and you could say they had in mind the Protestants when they wrote this, who completely rejected this sacrament along with the others. The Protestants gave a completely different interpretation to Saint James's words. So you could say their intention wasn't even this wasn't even in the scope. So I mean, yeah, you could give those sorts of responses to that. So, but definitely, yeah, they deviated from the ancient practice, and they basically appear to anathematize that.
Now, what I think is the biggest error, which is why I wrote my own book, The Rise and Fall of the Papacy, on this, but there's definitely a lot in the errors of the Latins on this topic, is papal infallibility and papal supremacy. Because honestly, Rome could fix everything else if it weren't for the fact that they at least must take the party line that nothing needs to be fixed because they have the final say and can never be wrong about it.
Mhm.
So you say next to filioque, it's the most serious issue. I know that historians like Meyendorff and Papadakis say this was actually the biggest issue. But that aside,
Yeah,
you claim the early church did not hold to the theory of the papacy as defined by Vatican I. So how about you unpack that for us?
yeah, yeah. In a way, I might make the other case of filioque is more important, at least earlier on, because the church would, I mean, it would have had forced we could have simply ignored papal supremacy and forced the Pope to anathematize simply for disobedience of the papal supremacy. But that alone, at least didn't make of course, it was influential, but not maybe the crucial point at the time of that 11th century. Maybe it could have held back a little bit on when that would have needed to be played. But anyway, yeah, either way, you're right. If you can say, having once accepted the papacy, everything else falls into place, because then we just have obedience to the Pope and let's settle every other point. So, yes, okay, Vatican I. Yes, so I mean, it's strange. It's almost sad. They really committed themselves way too far in Vatican I to make some extremely strong statements that are not. I don't see that supported at all by the early church. And you know this well, but my job.
Well, that's
Yeah,
worth just reiterating. If something like Vatican I was true, something that immensely important would have been reiterated a lot and very specifically from many sources and important sources. The fact that it's largely absent and even its echoes shows that this is something that has nothing to do with the early church.
yeah, they have to work hard to interpret the early fathers for the Vatican I definition, and what was I going to say? I know there was a big structure built upon these forgeries, and I mean,
Well, we didn't get
okay,
to the forgeries yet. So how about we
yeah,
start with Saint Cyprian, for example? And this is
sure,
more on the issue of maybe papal supremacy, alleged papal supremacy.
yeah, yeah. So Saint Cyprian, I mean, I really just recommend reading him at length, and I quote many pages of his writings, and more than that, I quote Saint Augustine's comments upon Saint Cyprian and the African Council, because you almost get this double reiteration and understanding of how the early church saw these things, of Augustine defending and justifying Saint Cyprian. And you see Saint Cyprian's error was not in disobedience to the Pope, but because a a council that settles the matter. So I mean, it's maybe the longest quote in my book. It's just 10 pages, and I do. Um, it's basically from Augustine's 7 books against the Donatists. I haven't seen any Roman Catholic really, I don't like take like cognizance of these passages and fairly give them their weight, because it's very clear that it's not the Pope that is supreme. There was no Vatican I idea of how the Church was seen. Yeah, just look at that as well. Yeah, look at Saint Cyprian and the comments by Saint Augustine, and how they resolve. I mean, the question itself of the validity of heretical baptism.
Oh, yeah, and just for
important.
little tidbits, Saint Cyprian says that no bishop could tyrannically rule over other bishops. He writes that in council. We have in letter 43, I think paragraph 20 of Saint Augustine's Corpus, where he says that if for the Donatists they thought the Catholics in Carthage were in error, they could appeal to a council in Rome. And if they think that the council in Rome was full of bad judges, they could appeal to a plenary council of the church. And so he takes for granted that Rome could be wrong and appealed from. I mean, this is exactly. He writes very plainly on this.
Yes, and multiple times, over and over again. It's a council that is the decision, an entire council that represents the decision of the Christendom, and the smaller council can be appealed to with a larger council until you get a general or ecumenical universal council. And I remembered earlier I wanted to mention there's a great book. I don't know if you've read it. It's called Roman Catholic Opposition to Papal Infallibility. It's by an Anglican author, Sparrow Simpson, if I remember right. I don't know if you've read it, but it's about 400 pages, just basically compilation of all these Roman Catholics who before Vatican I had denied that papal infallibility was either true or a dogma of the faith. So it's, I mean, rather startling that you have all these authorities against it. So, yeah, so
how about you speak about the Council of Chalcedon, Canon 28, Trullo, Canon 36. How about you give us some information how that's relevant to this question?
Yeah. And that's a huge part of the book, because these, especially Canon 28, comes up everywhere in these discussions. So I just wanted to go in depth, as deep as I could go into this topic, to just thoroughly research it, because I know the common sort of quote and counter quotes and all of that, but I just wanted to go in depth to get to the heart of these matters. And basically Canon 28 says that Constantinople has equal privileges to Rome and ranks second after it, and it's reiterated by Canon 36 of Trullo. And I show that the Council of Trullo is an ecumenical council. I spend a lot of pages on that, I think about 100 pages. And on Canon 28, I talk about the whole background to it. I know Roman Catholics, all the arguments, I kind of talk about all of this. And it is important, because this is the decision of the Council of Chalcedon, and they did not, they could not have held Constantinople to basically near equality with Rome if Rome was supreme. So that's why I think it's so important that we looked at that canon and the subsequent history of it.
Now, how about the history of Pope Honorius? What's this episode in a tidbit for someone who maybe is not aware? The alleged heretical Pope.
Pope Honorius, another thing. I mean, I hopefully without pride, I might say I've compiled the most comprehensive collection of passages to the condemnation of Pope Honorius. I think that's ever been collected. I mean, that's with the help of the internet. I couldn't do this without digitized books. I've just so many writings scanned online. Like, it would take me forever to go to all those libraries or to even search them. But in a summary, yes, Pope Honorius, he was a monothelite heretic. He held that Christ only had one will, and he was condemned as such, condemned as a heretic by the Sixth Ecumenical Council. And this condemnation was reiterated by popes, by later ecumenical councils, and by many fathers. So I basically quote everything that could be said, both for and against him. Uh, I give whatever defenses can be said for him, and I show how those are insufficient, or the arguments from silence, or so on. So yeah, I just give every evidence that Pope Honorius was a heretic and condemned as such. And I also spend a lot of time quoting how Roman Catholics have been at odds with themselves on how to deal with this question. They've
Yeah.
had a lot of different views, and I mean, in summary, most of the bishops who attended Vatican I did not believe that Pope Honorius was a heretic. They at most thought he was negligent. Many thought the whole records were a forgery. So yeah, they've had different views. Some say, yeah, everything has been a forgery. Some say the Greeks tampered with his letters. Um, Many say, okay, he was, yeah, just guilty of negligence, or uh, some minor issue. Or if they say he was a heretic, he was a heretic only in himself and not a formal heretic, or it was rather just he was a private heretic. You know, although he was writing to the Patriarch of Constantinople, which is the next highest ranking bishop, and these letters were public, and they were well known by the other heretics and were quoted widely by the heretical patriarchs and others. And I think the other defense, yeah, well, they'll fall back. If you push them, they'll just fall back on a defense that Pope Honorius, he never said anything ex cathedra. That's their final defense. I mean, I guess that's hard to break, because they might just say that specific conditions of ex cathedra were not met. Even though I quote some Roman Catholics saying his decision was ex cathedra, some say it was ex cathedra and true. But I mean, again, there's been huge inconsistency on this, and I mean, I think you could make the case that all these Roman Catholics are in schism by denying the condemnation of Pope Honorius, like as if saying, Arius was not a heretic and he was just misunderstood, or all his writings are forgeries, something like that. I mean, maybe I shouldn't push that point too far, but I think it is surprising how widely they disagree from the First Millennium Church, which reiterated this condemnation of Pope
Yeah,
Honorius.
in ecumenical councils and papal consecrations, they would reiterate the anathema against Honorius. Him being a heretic is even taken for granted in the minutes of Concil 869, 870. People could read it in page 314 in the Price translation. It's actually one of the points that hinge. Well, that's why you can't judge a pope without an ecumenical council if he's and you can only judge him for heresy. I talk about Honorius.
Yeah.
So interesting stuff. Now you quote Pope Innocent III about this whole thing about secular power. Like, this doesn't get talked about a lot, but there was a very long period of time of almost 1,000 years where really the chief interest of the Roman Catholic Church was their alleged secular authority over the kingdoms of Western and Central Europe. So could you unpack that a little bit?
Yeah, and Pope Innocent III, he stood at the height of the papal power in the 1200s, and I mean, it's almost like a time passed away. Like, it's so distant from us that we don't even think about this. The Pope doesn't have secular power anymore. For a long time, he was basically a prince or a king of the territory, the Papal States, and he had an army. And I mean, right now, the Pope does still have secular authority in the principality, or I guess the Vatican City State, and that's the only place remaining. But it's interesting to look at the history of this whole question from the British against how the Pope condemned Queen Elizabeth, basically releasing all her subjects from allegiance to the Queen. Although, to their credit, Roman Catholics were good citizens of the Queen and didn't rebel. But I mean, the Pope almost looked for any opportunity to use their power to the utmost, and it came forward at many times when there are different plots against the stability of states. And it's forgotten now. I mean, in American politics, it was also brought up when the first Roman Catholic president was, or first, there's a Roman Catholic governor running for president in the 1930s. I believe the guy, last name Smith. That was probably the last time the issue was seriously discussed on.
It was about Al Smith.
Yeah, I don't remember. Yeah, but yeah, of the question of can Roman Catholics be loyal to the Constitution if they're loyal to the Pope? But that's a whole separate subject. I mean, that's and many people worried that Vatican I actually basically committed some of these earlier statements of the popes, because those denying the secular power of the Pope said, well, he's not infallible, so these older statements are not binding. But there was a concern that with Vatican I, it didn't formally define this, but it's hard to read the papal statements that, um, such as Innocent the Third.
Yeah, it's hard to appreciate in some degrees because Roman Catholicism, since the 20th century, has modernized considerably. Pretty much ever since they lost the war against like Garibaldi and the Kingdom of Italy. That if you were in the 1500s, the Pope was claiming that he had the whole church, not the whole church, the whole world to govern. The Pope was claiming that only he could give indulgences, that he could give them out arbitrarily, whether or not it's a plenary indulgence or something, which means a full forgiveness of the temporal effects of sin, or limited by whatever many years. And so it was a very papal centric religion. The Pope was more than just some sort of very important celebrity that very rarely has some sort of like ex cathedra statement or something to make, but that he had a role that was understood to be paramount in pretty much every respect and with direct import on your life. And so this is the ethos of the Roman Catholic Church post schism, even if in recent decades, maybe about a century or so, this has began dissipating very quickly. But the indulgence theology still exists. I don't think the popes have ever fully renounced temporal power, have they? Are you aware?
I don't think. I mean, maybe the more modern popes, but I mean, you can read. It appears they never did disclaim temporal power, even into the, at least I just recently read an article written in the 1890s about this, about kind of warning about papal interference, or how loyal can Roman Catholics be citizens of America. I mean, some of it is things maybe is not were not fair or exaggerated, but the Pope, as far as I know, they never formally disclaimed this power. I mean, they hold it in abeyance, ready to use it when it could be suited for them. But we don't live in that sort of world anymore. It's a completely foreign world when compared to the time when they did have power. I mean, I've seen some defenses of this where Roman Catholics say, well, this was inherent in the constitutions of those, or basically the framework of these European monarchies, that the ruler, the king or queen, must be Catholic. So if they were a heretic, you don't have to follow them. And then the Pope decides who's a heretic. So that's how the Pope kind of has this indirect power over everyone. I mean, it's a bit convoluted. It was still a source of a lot of problems as well, like the papal intermingling in secular affairs. And,
Well, it's clearly very worldly in focus and not spiritual. I think anyone could admit that.
Yeah.
Now, as a little teaser, we can't flesh it out like we did the other topics, but the next 5 biggest errors. So, if this is the 5 biggest errors of Catholicism, this would be the 10 if you round it out. You say the Eucharist only under the form of bread.
Yes, that's the Eucharist under Christ's body and blood. They give what they'll say is only under the species of bread. They'll say Christ's body and blood is included in his body, so bread is sufficient. But again, that's another change you can date to many centuries after Christ. If I understand it right, I think sometime maybe 13th century. I forgot it now, but
Again, all these changes had just so happened to be post schism. You talk about here's a interesting topic: permitting marriage within prohibited degrees, like with your niece or sister-in-law. The Roman Catholic Church allows that.
Yeah, that was the main issue, with the Anglican Reformation. That the King Henry VIII, he said that he argued for the divorce with Catherine of Aragon, saying, she had been married to his older brother, Prince Arthur, who had passed away. So he was saying he should not, like the marriage should not have been valid. So he wanted to, uh, to have that nullified or divorced. And I mean, the Council of Trent made it a matter of faith that the Pope can dispense, or the Church can dispense in matters, in these degrees that were prohibited in Leviticus. So that includes, um, they've allowed niece and sister-in-law marriages. There's many of those cases. It culminated in some sad cases of inbreeding in some of the monarchies.
So you're saying Trent pretty much says that those rules, whether from scriptures or from tradition, is, and I could be wrong, I'm trying to understand you, are totally within the purview of the Pope himself?
So the Council of Trent, it made it a matter of faith that the Church can dispense in those Levitical degrees. It actually anathematizes anyone who says that the Church cannot dispense in those.
So what do you mean by dispense? Mean they could do whatever they please?
Yes, yeah, to allow a permission with papal authority,
or not to?
Yes, or to prohibit it. Yes, and
so essentially gives the Pope this arbitrary final say based upon just what he feels like doing, kind of like the indulgences.
They'll say it's, yeah. I mean, in the Council of Trent, I mean, it's ideally for a good reason. So the Pope, like, there has to have a good cause to make a dispensation. They'll say, in the second degree, a dispensation shall never be granted except in the case of great princes and for a public cause. Second degree is first cousins. So, I mean, in practice, they were not that strict. They often granted first cousin marriages without necessary being, a great prince and for a public cause. And they gave even nearer degrees.
Well, public cause is that Pig's Knuckle, Arkansas would be in an uproar if they couldn't marry their cousins.
Yeah, it's right. I mean, and I did. There was something I looked into in depth. It can get really complicated, marriage law. It's just almost a never-ending labyrinth in a way. But I tried to isolate it to those 2 points. Uncle niece marriages. This was never allowed in the early church. They held that Levitical degrees were still binding. I found some examples of it happening, but it was condemned by the church and held to be illegitimate. I looked into, even there were like Protestant rumors that the Pope allowed a brother-sister marriage. I spent a lot of time trying to find out, but that was a rumor. But it's been saying it had been said that the Pope would have allowed a brother-sister marriage. Many Roman Catholics give the Pope that authority. There was a brother-sister marriage allowed to remain when where is it? Where did I find that? There was a case, but they had been non-Catholic. They had converted from paganism to Catholicism, and the Vatican allowed that to stand in the year 1917, something like that. But that's different because they were converting from, they were just converting in with their previous wife. But otherwise, for a dispensation, it deviates from the early church. They held these were binding, and they don't even follow the Council of Trent. It said these dispensations should be free, but that wasn't the case in practice. It said it should be limited, but they frequently gave, those dispensations. So that's another deviation, and it's a completely, huge difference from the early church.
Now, how about not baptizing people by triple immersion standard mode? I mean, my presumption is that the Roman Catholic Church still does 3 sprinklings or 3 pourings. At what point did they not do this?
Yeah, I wrote a lot about this because this was something, the first sacrament, baptism. I would say it's by degrees, and there were changes. First, it was not always doing a triple action or triple immersion. It would sometimes be a single immersion. Then later on, they did pouring and then sprinkling. So this was one of the most thorough researched parts in the book, where I just compiled everything I could find in the first 6 centuries of all the church fathers saying baptism is done by triple immersion, and just quoting everything to that effect. But there were, exceptions. And the first major one is Pope Gregory I. I talk about why he allowed a single immersion and all that, but it's clearly a deviation, and yeah, that's also mentioned in the historical list from the 1895, 1848 encyclicals.
Now, how about the dogma of the Immaculate Conception?
Yeah, another novel decree. I don't see any support for this at all in the early church. I think the Anglican scholar Edward Pusey, he wrote a great book on that subject. It's about 550 pages, just basically a compilation of church fathers and then medieval Roman Catholic authorities against the Immaculate Conception. I mean, it was defined in 1854, and that was the occasion of many first to be disillusioned with Roman Catholicism. I think Abbe Gaté, he said that was kind of his wake up call to no longer follow Roman Catholicism, because they made it a matter of faith, whereas beforehand it was a pious opinion. And they also, before it was a matter of faith, it was prohibited to call someone a heretic if they denied the Immaculate Conception. In fact, if you called someone a heretic for denying the Immaculate Conception, you were condemned. So you weren't even allowed to say it was a matter of faith. Although, and they, at the Council of Trent, they specifically forbade discussion on this point because they wanted unity against Protestantism. They did not want to exacerbate any differences between different factions, such as, I think, Dominicans and Franciscans. So they simply wanted to have a little compromise. In the Council of Trent's decree on original sin, they mention that they're not taking in scope the Virgin Mary. So they specifically didn't want to talk about that.
Now, how about lastly, the significant use of forgeries in accurate historical records? I think someone could say, well, everyone, in ancient times and medieval times had problems with this. So you're saying this is maybe the next fifth biggest error of Roman Catholicism. Why them specifically?
Yeah, it's true, like how important they are. I mean, the whole second volume, or at least about more than half of the second volume, is on forgeries. Now, yeah, you could argue, it's more of like an emotional argument, like, oh, look how many forgeries there are. It's like, maybe it's not. I mean, these are not necessarily failings of the institutions, but they were they were very valuable in influencing some Orthodox to convert to Roman Catholicism. And they had, at least several of them had a huge impact. Like I would say the top one is Thomas Aquinas's Against the Errors of the Greeks. That was probably the biggest quote mine from the year, I think around, I forgot the year, 12 something, let's say 1250 to around a little bit in the early 1700s. So almost 500 years. This was the quote mine that was always cited against the Orthodox. All these false quotes on the Filioque, Purgatory, papacy, and leavened bread, those 4 points. And besides that were the pseudo-Isidorian decretals and a donation of Constantine. And then there's some other issues. I bring up some other issues that are probably not important, but just to help provide more context on issues or forgeries, or at least disputed points. So I had received some good criticism from Roman Catholics based on, I had an appearance with Jay Dyer back in 2020, and I had a good conversation after that with a Roman Catholic who critiqued a lot of the items I brought up. And I mean, some of them are not necessarily mistakes. It's more like, okay, we don't know what the original authentic words are, or it's a textual variant, so we can't confidently say this is a forgery. So I moderated my words in some places and updated some.
So long story short, that there's a lot of documents used about just Roman Catholic claims, which are either chock full full-blown forgeries, like and Thomas Aquinas Against Greek Errors, or in other cases, they are passages and sources that scholars in the modern era have called into question. So even if there's still debate around it, it's not an unquestionable source. Would that be a fair way to put it?
Yeah. For some of them, I just say, there's debate. This is maybe not a forgery. So others, I just compile. Maybe they're not important on their own, but I think you could collect them together to show a concerning kind of habit in many places to not be accurate with records. So
it is interesting that in all these centuries of debate, and now we're having, I'd say, a good 150-year stretch of modern scholarship, if we could find like what they've done since the 1860s and 70s of critical scholarship, that for the Roman Catholic sources, their forgeries are questionable sources, and a lot of them. But for the Orthodox doctrinal stance on these same questions, there's not this mass accusation of forgeries on the ecclesiastical questions, and even on other points of doctrine, whether it be the Christological doctrines, for example. There is a acknowledgement that there are some sources that are potentially forged, and there's other sources which are undeniable. And so it does seem that while forgery is not something that is completely something that's part of Roman Catholicism, there's been forgeries throughout history, that they're much more notable and extensive and have had more profound effect on Roman Catholic belief than anything in Eastern or Oriental Orthodoxy, for that matter. So that being said, I want to point people to purchase a book from Uncut Mountain Press, Errors of the Catholics. These books are huge. They are encyclopedic. They're made for you to pick it up, read what you want to read, and put it back down. You could read it cover to cover and pretty much then not need the internet ever again, I suppose, because you'll have so much information. But they are a fantastic physical resource. And the reality is people learn better from physical resources. This is definitely a book worth having if you want a lot of information at your fingertips. And I just also want to point people that the link is below if you want to purchase both volumes of The Errors of the Latins by George, published by Uncut Mountain Press. Also, if this show has blessed you, please support the mission in Cambodia at orthodoxchristiantheology.com/donate. Links to the PayPal, Patreon, and Venmo. PayPal is preferred are below, but if you want to be a monthly contributor, please sign up for the Patreon and help support the mission work in Cambodia, or consider becoming a missionary yourself. orthodoxchristiantheology.com/donate. So, George, before we run, is there anything you'd like to add?
No, I think that's it. Thank you so much for having me, Craig.
Well, it's been a pleasure, and I will end this show as I end all of them by quoting Jesus the Rock. Fight to death for the truth, and the Lord God will fight for you. God bless you. Have a great day.